All right, welcome back to another edition of Political Breakfast. Thanks for checking in with us again the second time this week. I'm Lisa Rayam, and you're listening on WABE. And with me is Republican strategist Brian Robinson and Saba Long, who's in for Tharon this week. Saba, of course, is from the Atlanta Civic Circle. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hi there.
A lot going on these past few days. And one thing that we didn't touch on earlier in the week was that Georgia Tech Public Policy School to be renamed after former President Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn. What an honor that will be for Georgia Tech and Georgians as well, right?
It's a well-deserved honor, and it's also a prestigious name for Georgia Tech. Obviously, President Carter was a Georgia Tech graduate, and
Right.
we heard from Jason Carter, his grandson, that Tech remained near and dear to the president throughout his life. And I think it's of note that it's not the Jimmy Carter Center. It's the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter Public Policy School. They were a duo. They were a team when it came to public policy and in their philanthropic efforts throughout the entirety of their very long lives. And I think it's also of note that to get that name on a school at Georgia Tech took a vote of the Board of Regents, which is a board full of Republicans because every seat is filled by the governor of Georgia. And so some were originally put on there by Nathan Deal. Most of them now are put on there by Brian Kemp. So they're all Republicans, all of them taking a vote to honor a Democrat in this way. So that goes to show you what time can do, what a life of service can do when it comes to healing political divisions and seeing this guy's life as one of momentous consequence, seeing his name as one that is positive and a attraction for the school. So congrats to the Carters, a well-earned and well-deserved honor.
I'm sure many more tributes like this are to come for both Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. I know what we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the state of the Democratic Party, the chairmanship there, ever since Nikema Williams stepped down a couple of weeks ago, and rumblings that they may pick one soon. Correct, Saba?
Yeah, the election is May 3rd, and they're having candidate forums right now. You asked what's the state of the Democratic Party in Georgia? I think a lot of folks are asking that question. TBD, right?
What's happening here? What's happening? What's happening with it, and from your vantage point?
I think it was wise, to say the least, for Nikema to step down. And then there's a question about what is the path going forward. Really, the election for Democrats starts this year in 2025. They've got 2 public service commissioner seats up this year that are statewide, and they should be really making an effort to win those 2 and then get ready for 2026 when you have Ossoff, you've got the gubernatorial and state elections down the board. There's really a question of what is the role of DPG in this moment? Are they to be a consensus and bridge builder and try to attract independents? Are they there to provide cover for elected officials, like we talked about in the earlier episode, when they need to make votes that may not be comfortable, votes where they're really focused on representing their specific constituents rather than the party at large? So what I'm looking forward to watching in these candidate forums coming up, they've got 4 candidate forums across the country, across the state, including one in Cobb County on Saturday, the 26th. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe, candidates, including Charlie Bailey, a name that some folks would know, who ran for lieutenant governor. Hardy Davis, Wendy Davis, Nabila Islam Parks is a name that we talk about often on Political Breakfast as well, and Jamie Allen, as well as Jay Jones. And so it's going to be, I think, a contentious race.
Crowded field there.
Crowded field. I think the big thing that Democrats need to make sure they do is make sure that the process is fair and that it's not where they are appointing someone to this position and the vote is, a foregone conclusion.
And the position is hard work, right? They're
Absolutely.
They're trying to stress how
they've got to raise
this is
money.
not an easy. Yeah.
That's their number one goal. They need to raise as much money as possible for 25 and 26.
That's right. And so, it would be smart of the Democrats to not that I'm in the business of giving advice to Democrats, but if I'm in their shoes, the Democrats probably need to focus on somebody whose fundraising prowess is provable, someone who's got a network of national donors that they can go to, not just in state. There's a temptation in these cases because the people who show up at party meetings are activists and ideologues, and that's your voting base for these positions. And the problem is those folks end up spending all their time in a bunch of internecine warfare between uh, battling portions of the party, and that's what they love. Those people live for that. They live for it, and it's a huge time suck, and it doesn't move you forward in any way. And if this seems very personal, it is, because I see Republicans do the exact same thing, and it drives me absolutely bonkers. It just misses the forest for the trees. So Democrats have an opportunity here to be strategic and to be smart and to get a fundraiser and an organizer, somebody with, who can raise money and have some management capacity. And if they don't, I would get a fundraiser and then hire a deputy who has some management capacity. That's what is a smart way forward. And hey, Big Phil, maybe what we're seeing here is people who just need a job, because for the first time ever, the job's going to pay. So maybe people are like, hey, yeah, well, I wasn't interested in the volunteer position, but man, if there's a little bit of cash coming my way, sign me up.
Yeah, it comes with pay, but there's going to be a lot of pressure on whoever gets that job, right? Coming after
That's right.
Nakima because,
Who would
you
want it?
know,
God, what a
yeah.
terrible job. I mean, on either side, it's thankless, and you just deal with a bunch of complainers all the time. No thanks.
That's true. But I think really the question for Democrats is going to be, how do they, beyond DPG, right? How are they conquering the state? Because we've already talked about there's a 50-50 chance on the gubernatorial side, right? And if they can repeat what they did with Ossoff and Warnock, that's what they're going to try to figure out for 2026 in particular. And that can't just be the Democratic Party of Georgia. It has to be other efforts. And who knows what ends up happening with Fair Fight or New Georgia Project. But if I were them, I would get rid of New Georgia Project, because at this point it's practically defunct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
moot.
And
Then
a bad
create
brand now.
something new.
And the bad
And a
brand now.
bad brand. Yeah, and a bad brand. And create, some new entity, right? That entity, all they're doing is focused on talking to everyday Georgians who are saying, hey, we want folks who focus on the economy, who focus on making our lives better, not these red meat issues.
We keep talking about Stacy Abrams, kind of, sorta. Could you see her as chair?
No.
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 I mean,
No.
that's a very low profile job. I mean, how many Georgians even know that Nakima Williams was chair? Or how
Yeah,
many
but
know
she's
that Josh
hard.
McCoon is chair of the Republican Party? I mean,
But Stacey Abrams would make it her own, I'm sure. She would work and get it out there, I think. I think she would make that job
No, I
her
think she
own.
would put someone in the role.
right.
Charlie
Okay.
Bailey was probably one of the closer who has strong Stacey ties.
But you got to remember, Stacey's somebody who thought that the U.S. Senate was beneath her, right? She turned down the chance to run in 2020, the seat that Raphael Warnock eventually won. I believe that if she had run, she would have won too, but she had no interest in that. So if the U.S. Senate is something you poo-poo, then being state party chair is just not going to be something on your radar.
I don't know if she was poo-pooing the Senate, but
Just had her eye on other things at the time. Yeah,
exactly.
for sure, for sure. Well, I want to jump into this subject since I teased it earlier in the week. A hearing taking place in Atlanta this week regarding international student visas. Over 100 students, and this is across the country, some here in Georgia, had their immigration status terminated by President Trump. And reportedly, they were told via email by the Department of Homeland Security that they must self-deport within 7 days if they want to avoid being arrested. So, any thoughts on this, still taking place, and just the narrative, that it's sending, to throughout the country, but to Georgians as well?
This is a really tricky topic, and Saba, if you want to go first, I'm fine with that. But I believe firmly in the right of the American government What are you laughing at me for?
Well, Saba said, no, no, you take it
Okay,
first,
yeah.
and
Um,
then I'll jump in. Yeah.
so yeah, it's very tricky because when you talk about it, race, ethnicity, religion, identity, all of that stuff is front and center in this debate. And so if you engage in the debate, somebody calls you a racist, right? That's where we start. If you talk about this, I believe very firmly that the United States government has a right to determine which non citizens can be here and which can't. I think it has the right to say, we don't appreciate you being on a campus and espousing views that are anti US foreign policy. That is not the role for foreigners in this country. Yes, everyone has a right to the First Amendment, and no one was arrested for their opinions. People were arrested for their behaviors if they engaged in violent protest or did not obey law enforcement orders to evacuate some of these tent cities they had during those pro Palestinian protests. But we have the right as Americans to determine who comes here and who doesn't. And we have a right to make those decisions based on reasons that some people find objectionable or offensive. It is our right, and it is the right of every other country. Many of these pro Palestinian protesters are from countries that would not allow me to come and spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? I would be put in prison for doing that. And some of our LGBTQ friends, if they went to those countries engaged in homosexual behavior, they may be given the death penalty. So other countries have their standards and we have ours, and each administration gets to determine what those are. I believe in that wholeheartedly. I got pushback on this issue in a debate very recently saying that how dare you say that we shouldn't welcome anybody who shows up. That was literally what was said to me, and it was flooring. That is so extreme, so out of touch. That is not where Americans are. Independents, Republicans, or even many Democrats. We do not have the responsibility to take everybody who shows up at our doorstep because not everybody who shows up at our doorstep is best for America. Not everybody has our best interest in heart. Not everyone shares our values. And that gets to be a tricky debate too, but I stand by it. There are American values. We don't want people coming here who think that little girls shouldn't be taught to read. We don't want people coming here who want to impose a caste system as they have in their country. We don't want that. That's an American value. We have a right. We have a responsibility to future generations of Americans to keep some of that out of here.
Saba?
Where do I start?
Yeah, I was going to say, I saw you taking it all in, and, you're getting prepped and ready at
Well,
the mic there. So let's hear what you have to say.
let me start with the student protests part of this. Student protests is as about American as apple pie. We have seen student protest across decades, whether it was Vietnam War, whether it was civil rights, that has been par for the course, whether it was Occupy Wall Street, right? And so oftentimes student protests have been a point of moral urging for the country to do what's right by the people at large. So that's number one. Number two, the facts are that not everyone who has been targeted has done wrong, right? That is fundamentally a fact. And it's also true that even American citizens have been targeted. So this is not just about folks who might be here on a visa, a student visa or otherwise. So I think there's a lot to this story than maybe what folks might be realizing and understanding. It is very nuanced. And yes, even folks who are in this country who are not citizens have a right to due process, have a right to a First Amendment, et cetera. And I want to make sure that we are all clear and mindful of that. I think if this were happening, if the way that we are going about this were happening in another country, in another time, Americans would say, hey, that's not right. I don't like what's going on here. And for whatever reason, Republicans, I think in particular, are maybe privately saying that they're not okay with it, but publicly doing something else.
Having to stand with it, yeah, because
That's right.
this is
I-
bringing anxiety all across the board. You know, when
I-
people talk about it, you see everybody starting to get a little weary by a lot of the
that's
things that
right.
are coming from Washington.
Ultimately, again, a party that believes in free speech and says, hey, you should have a right to say when you disagree with something. And I'm not talking about anti-American rhetoric, Brian. I don't think most folks are talking about anti-American rhetoric. That is your right to be able to say what is happening is fundamentally wrong from a moral standpoint. Right? That's what we're talking about here. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about this for another 50 minutes.
And I could too.
But it's unfortunate we have to talk about this, right? It's unfortunate.
Well,
Do you both
remember-
agree that it's unfortunate?
Well, look, I think some of the underlying issue here is anytime you have an era of mass migration and intense cultural impact because of it, there's a backlash. We've seen it throughout American history, and we're seeing it happen in other countries that are experiencing it, particularly in Europe. Places where you don't hear about it are places that aren't having mass migration, right? So any place where you have a huge culture clash coming in large numbers, there's a backlash. And we saw during the Biden administration the highest levels of mass migration in the history of America. And we saw it, and it wasn't all positive. And liberals want to be like, hey, the more the merrier, come one, come all. You know,
I don't think that's what liberals, well, maybe some liberals are doing that, but writ large, that's not what they're doing.
but that's
I
what
think
Biden's
most
policy
folks,
was. I think anywhere in the world where you have an era of mass migration, you're going to see a backlash. And the last 4 years during the Biden administration, we had the highest levels of mass migration in the history of our country. And previous mass migrations cause backlash. It's always going to be the case. You're seeing it in other countries that have had, a million folks in the Middle East show up in Europe. You've seen, you know, far right parties emerge because big parts of the country don't like it, right? So we're not an outlier. And I think one thing that I disagree with is basically if you express concern or you don't want massive cultural change in a short period of time, you're canceled, you're silenced. The position of the left is shut up. They explained, shut up, they explained, and I think you're seeing people tired of being told to shut up. And
but we're talking about two different things, Brian. So there's a difference between a student on a visa saying that they disagree with what we are doing with respect to, Israel, Gaza. That's a completely different than someone entering the country illegally and, at the border for whatever reason. Those are two completely separate issues. So there's addressing the border crisis, which I think a lot of folks would agree has been a problem. All right. And there needs to be some efforts, not just in the United States, but for folks who are seeking asylum, whether it's political asylum or trying to, better their financial future, better their life, there's a process that should be in place for them. So there's a difference between the person who's coming and trying to cause harm and the person who's coming for asylum purposes, right? The fact of the matter is, even folks who are already here on asylum have been asked to leave. So where do they go? Right. And I remember saying in an episode, a political breakfast episode, maybe a month or so ago, God forbid we are ever in that situation where you are trying to seek asylum because what's happening in your country is reprehensible and there's no other place for you to go. Those are two very different things. We're not talking about the person who killed Laken Riley, right? We're talking about the person who's trying to have a better life.
Trying to go to school, trying to make things better, right?
I hear
Getting
you.
caught up.
That makes what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. And where I don't think they're two separate issues is because of mass migrations, the tolerance of a lot of Americans, even for folks whose stories are sympathetic, even for folks who are highly educated and can contribute to our economy immediately, are not going to be a burden on taxpayers or social services. I think it's less than the tolerance of Americans for any immigration to some degree. That's where I think they're tied. And I understand what you're saying, that they are separate issues. And if we had not had the broken border and the millions rushing in, I think we would be in a very different place. I think that one thing that's benefited America is immigration from Asia, Africa, Europe, that brings in the best and brightest of those countries. So many of the Nobel Prize winners in science who come from America were born in another country, right? That is a great example of how we're benefiting from that. I think the broken border, the mass migration, has made it really hard to have a system that allows all that, right? I think you're seeing this backlash. That's where I think they're combined. And if we had not had that broken border, I don't think we'd be in the position where we'd be deporting students, because most of those students can come here and probably get a high-paying job and be productive taxpayers. That's how it should work. A broken system has led to bad choices, right? Bad options. And I think that's where Republicans and Democrats are going to see the issue very differently. Democrats are like, how dare you do this? And we're like, how dare y'all did that? How dare y'all let all those people in here and created this chaos that we have? Does that make sense?
To some extent. I mean, it's not. The reality is, addressing the border requires bipartisan support. It's not just something that one party alone has responsibility for. And time again, both parties have failed to address the issue. And so what we're seeing is Trump taking an extreme stance as a way to address it. But Congress is not doing anything about it. The Senate's not doing anything about it, right? It's all the executive branch. And then there's a question about what authority does the executive branch have or not, which is what we're seeing take place in the courts, right? Where time and time again, an action is taken and the courts are determining, is this action within the purview of the president or not? This is an incredibly complex issue, but I will say a number of folks I have talked to, both students, Americans who, naturalized, and even Americans who were born here but have immigrant parents, are very much concerned. They're concerned about the rhetoric that they are seeing and the actions that are taking place. And if you can lock up an American citizen and send them to another country, I don't know what becomes of America.
Wow, well said. And let's end it right there, because it is a complicated issue that we could talk about for weeks and weeks to come.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So again, this hearing taking place this week, and I'm sure we'll pick up the subject again. Enjoy your days, and we're not going to tattle on you, Brian, because you were in a nice place with some sunshine. That's all we'll say.
That's right. Yeah, I want to point out to our listeners and to y'all, I chose to be with y'all over going to the Dalton show where my daughter is right now. So I could have been riding with the Dolphins.
We appreciate that. Saba, as always, thank you so much for saying yes and checking in when we need you. Until next time, thanks.
Bye, guys.